Death Watch was one of the most memorable third-party factions that appeared in Star Wars The Clone Wars. A faction of Mandalorians that wanted to return Mandalore to its warrior roots. They were a staple of the show right up until the end. But Dave Filoni and the writers of The Clone Wars weren't the first ones to come up with the Death Watch. The Mandalorian terrorist group had appeared previously in the expanded universe, in which they were the rivals of the True Mandalorians, another faction that came to be led by Jango Fett. In this video, we'll be diving into the untold story of the Death Watch and why Jango Fett hated their guts. Now, just quickly guys, this video is brought to you by Surfshark. Surfshark is undoubtedly the best VPN to secure your online presence. Especially during these corona times, a lot of people, including myself, are spending a lot more time on the internet, and that's why it's so important that we need to encrypt our data. Surfshark is by far the best VPN you can use to do this. First things first, it's totally unlimited, so you can use it on as many devices as you like, which is a massive plus, seeing as literally no other VPNs allow this. The best thing about Surfshark, in my opinion though, is how well they protect you from those weird targeted ads that a lot of us get. This is exactly how your online data is being used against you, and Surfshark does a brilliant job of combating that. So if you're looking for a VPN with 24/7 customer support, a 30-day money-back guarantee, and strictly no logs, meaning nobody can know what you're doing online, not even Surfshark, then make sure you click that link in the description below. In 58 BBY, an 8-year-old boy living on Concord Dawn watched a band of dark armored men storm his family's farm. The night before, they had taken in a small band of Mandalorians, which proved to be a fatal mistake. As the young boy watched, the men in dark armor slaughtered his entire family and set their farm ablaze. He was only saved from an untimely death by the very Mandalorians his family had died protecting. That young boy's name was Jango Fett, and just like that, he had gotten himself mixed up in the Mandalorian Civil War. That deadly conflict had its roots in an earlier war, the Mandalorian Excision of 738 BBY. In that conflict, the Republic Judicial Forces, under the leadership of the Jedi Order, launched a preemptive strike on the Mandalorians, who they believed were preparing for yet another crusade. In a decisively brutal assault, the Republic bombarded whole regions of Mandalore and a number of other Mandalorian worlds until they were deserts of white sand, breaking the back of the rising Mandalorian threat in the process. In the aftermath of the conflict, a pacifist faction called the New Mandalorians built a new civilization out in the wastelands, rejecting the warrior codes and making peace with the Republic. Nominally, they took control of Mandalorian space, but contrary to what they liked to claim, their rise wasn't the end of the warrior clans. The Mandalorians of the countryside and the more distant Mandalorian worlds quietly continued living as they had lived for millennia, keeping the traditions of the Mando'Ada alive. They called themselves Akalit, or the Faithful, to contrast with the faithless New Mandalorian. As they had before the Excision, the Mandalorians would continue to wear their traditional Beskar armor, and they would continue to be led by the greatest warrior among them, who would claim the title of Mandalore. But nonetheless, the warriors were diminished in numbers and strength by the rise of the New Mandalorians, and over the years, they would become diminished in reputation as well. Some started to see the Akalit as little more than thugs, and the Mandalorians themselves didn't do much to change such views. Perhaps the most notorious example of Mandalorian thuggery during this period was the Ithilin genocide, in which the Akalit wiped out an entire planet over a dispute over booze. Many Akalit called for change, disillusioned with how the Mandalorians had degenerated. In 60 BBY, when an ex-journeyman protector named Jaster Mareel became Mandalore, he heeded these calls and authored a Super Commando Codex, a modern interpretation of the warrior codes of old. Mareel called for the Akalit to live as honorable mercenaries instead of thugs, and took inspiration from the ancient canons of honor the Mandalorians had followed during the time of the Tongs. But some rejected Mareel's call for reform. Disgusted by what he viewed as weakness in the ranks of the Akalit, a man named Tor Vizsla broke off and formed the Death Watch. The Death Watch vowed not to reform the Mandalorians, but to return them to glory, and eventually to attempt once more to conquer the entire galaxy. Vizsla and the Death Watch attempted to stage a coup against Mareel and his followers, who declared themselves the true Mandalorians, thus beginning the Mandalorian Civil War. 2 years after the start of the conflict, it made its way to Concord Dawn, where it upended young Jango Fett's life. The Mandalorians the Fetts had taken in were none other than Jaster Mareel and his closest allies, who the Death Watch believed had burned with the farm. They moved into a nearby town to celebrate with a raid, but they were ambushed by the true Mandalorians, who were far from dead. During the battle, Jango was able to kill the man who had murdered his parents, proving himself a capable fighter despite his young age. That battle all but wiped out the Death Watch, and for the next few years, Tor Vizsla was forced to take to the shadows. The seemingly triumphant Mareel adopted Jango as his son and heir following the battle, and over the course of the next 6 years, Fett would become a promising young Mandalorian. After Concord Dawn, the Death Watch became far more subtle, opting to use trickery instead of brute force to fight their true Mandalorian rivals. In 52 BBY, they lured Mareel and his men to Quarter 6 by blackmailing the local government. The Cordons hired the true Mandalorians to deal with a local insurrection, but the insurrectionary force turned out to be larger and stronger than the Mandalorians had been told. Mareel ordered a retreat, but at that moment, Vizsla and the Death Watch executed an ambush. True Mandalorian forces were split in the chaos. A group under Jango Fett and his friend Silas were pinned down, while elsewhere, Jaster Mareel and his second-in-command, Montross, fought back against Vizsla's vanguard. Mareel was wounded by a grenade blast, which Montross avoided with his jetpack, but when the injured Mandalore called to Montross for help, Montross abandoned him, wishing to claim Mareel's title for himself. Jaster Mareel was killed by fire from Tor Vizsla's tank, and the true Mandalorians were forced to retreat and regroup. During the retreat, Fett broke off to retrieve Jaster's body, and Montross used his absence to claim that he, too, had been killed by Vizsla. But as Montross tried to claim the title of Mandalore, Jango showed up with Jaster's corpse and revealed how Montross had abandoned his leader. The true Mandalorians sided with Fett over Montross, exiling him and declaring Jango the new Mandalore. Jango rallied the true Mandalorians and launched a new campaign against the Death Watch, who had once more taken his family from him. Over the course of the next few years, the Death Watch was crippled once again, and once more it went into hiding. By 44 BBY, the true Mandalorians once more seemed to be victorious, and they thrived under the leadership of Jango Fett. But Tor Vizsla wasn't ready to call it quits yet. He made an alliance with the governor of Galadran, the planet on which the last of the Death Watch had hidden, and once the Death Watch had recovered, they once more sprang a trap for the true Mandalorians. The governor hired Jango and his men to put down a local insurrection, which the true Mandalorians were able to do in short order. But as they did so, the governor contacted the Jedi Council, claiming that the Mandalorians were instead murdering political activists and civilians. The council dispatched Jedi Master Dooku and a strike force of Jedi to Galadran in response. Upon their arrival, the Jedi took the governor on his word and ordered the true Mandalorians to surrender or die. Fett and his men refused to submit to arrest, and the disastrous Battle of Galadran ensued. The true Mandalorians slew many Jedi that day. Jango Fett killed several with his bare hands near the end of the battle, but the Jedi were simply stronger and the Mandalorians were overcome. At the end of the battle, only 2 of the true Mandalorians were left alive, Jango Fett and Silas. Fett was captured by Dooku and delivered to the governor of Galadran, who stole his armor and sold him into slavery. The Death Watch was victorious. Jango Fett spent 2 years as a slave aboard a spice transport before he was able to escape. When he did, he went right back to Galadran, where he reclaimed his armor and beat the governor into telling him where Vizsla had gone. With a score to settle, Jango pursued Vizsla's ship, the Deathrattle, to Corellia, where he rammed his ship into Vizsla's engines, boarded the vessel through the bridge viewports, and fought the leader of the Death Watch all the way to the escape pods. As the Deathrattle went down, the 2 ejected from the craft, landing in the Corellian wilderness. There, the battle continued. During the fight, Vizsla managed to inject Fett with a poison that slowed his reflexes, thus gaining the upper hand. But even as he went down, Jango slashed open Vizsla's stomach with blades fired from his gauntlet. The smell of blood promptly attracted a pack of Corellian dire cats, who mauled the Death Watch leader, killing him even as Fett lapsed into unconsciousness. Tor Vizsla was dead, and Fett recovered a short while later, having at last avenged his friends and mentor. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. As far as he knew, Jango Fett was the last of the true Mandalorians. He would spend the next decade wandering the galaxy as a bounty hunter, distraught over his failure to protect the only family he had. The Death Watch scattered after the death of their leader. Many of them were killed when the Deathrattle went down, including almost all of their leaders. In time, they would regroup under Pre Vizsla, who was presumably Tor's son on Concordia, but it would be 2 decades before they revealed themselves again. While Jango Fett lived, none among the Death Watch dared to show themselves, for fear of Jango's wrath. So that's the story of how the Death Watch came to be and why Jango Fett hated them with a passion. But what do you think? Would you like to hear a more in-depth video about the Mandalorian Civil War? Let us know in the comment section below. And if you want to find the music used in this video and in plenty of videos before it, then make sure you check out our Relax Jack music channel, link at the top of the description. And if you want access to the custom thumbnails we often post on our videos as well, then make sure you check out our Patreon. You'll also get access to an exclusive behind the scenes Discord server. And if you just want to join the wider Geetsly's community, check us out on our main Geetsly's Discord, where you can chat to myself and other Star Wars fans, and our Geetsly's Gaming Network, where you can play games with other Star Wars fans. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.